Alright, time for me to pull a little bit of a right cheeky fast one. Now, I know if we're going through the order of the tomes, it was meant to be either Spirit or Doctor, but we're going to be focusing on the Blight here. I feel like I get away with this because I did initially miss out the Hunger, which was meant to be about the Alchemist, or now called the Blight. And we've also got, in the Unleash archives, we got the new story for the Blight, which is Doors Unknown. So I figured, hey, why not collectively mush these two together and do an overall story about what I think of both of them. To essentially do a tome talk about these two and the Blight in general, which should be fun. Don't worry, after I'm done with this, I will get back to the scheduled flow, and it will just go along the lines of how it's structured in the actual tomes itself. So we'd probably be hitting Doctor, then Spirit next, and so on and so forth in that order. But hey, let's continue on. Also, I do apologize for the atrocious gameplay you're probably going to have to watch with this, because I suck with Blight. Like, I am terrible with Blight. You are also probably going to have to watch very terrible gameplay if we ever come across Nurse. So, just a little heads up, the gameplay is going to suck, but hopefully I can at least keep you entertained with my words and be the lore guy that I normally am. Alright guys, this is going to be a bit of a longer video here because we are talking about two different tomes. We are talking about The Hunger, which is about the Alchemist, quote-unquote, the Blight, and we're also talking about The Doors Unknown, which is about the Blight or Mr. Talbot Grimes. So prepare, sit back, and let's talk about this mad scientist who essentially twisted himself into the brutal monster that we now know today, and had a hand in brutalizing and twisting the killers into the Blight mutations that we know. Let's start off with The Hunger. This is the slow descent that Talbot Grimes ends up going across. This is before he becomes the Blight, before he becomes twisted in the whole mindset. We essentially hear him going through heavy withdrawal. This is after he's dealt with the whole situation of the killers experimenting on them. As the even story goes, he remembers experimenting on the Doctor and all the other killers, not knowing if he genuinely feels remorse for these bloodthirsty monsters who have essentially been hunting him. We know that, by the way, it describes it that Talbot used to be a survivor, or at least something akin to that. He mentions the Void, mentions the other survivors in there, mentions them being empty, broken, emotionless, and useless to the entity. He mentions crawling out of the Void, escaping it. So we know along the lines Talbot Grimes was at least a survivor to some extent. We know that he then stumbled upon a way to experiment with the killers, a way to test them, a way to change them and modify them. He even caught people like the Doctor, did ironically tests of torture and mutation on the Doctor like he had done with other people. But eventually he was found, maybe caught, and flung into the Void by the entity. Now, after a while, after experiencing the Void, experiencing just how broken, emotionally burnt these people are, he crawls out and finds a flower, finds his salvation again. And we start to see him slowly slip and start to see the dependency come on. And this is an interesting note as we also start to see the entity slowly manipulating him, slowly twisting him, until the Blight ends up coming up with one final request. A flower. One final flower, one final way to get serum. And if he does, he'll basically do whatever the entity wants. He'll go in there, he'll tear apart survivors, tear apart killers, do whatever he has to do to get more. And in this, we see the entity finally gets his claws on a new potential target. Essentially turning a survivor who has become a emotionless husk into a new weapon, a new tool, a killer, a brutal force. And this is what becomes of the Blight. He goes along with this, and the entity rewards him with flowers, and he takes the sweet injection that he craved, twisting and mutating and changing into what we know as the Blight. Twisted, mutated, and deformed killer indeed. Now, what does this mean? We essentially see just how maddening the entity can be and just how resourceful it is. It saw interest in Talbot's experimentations, saw that they were useful, but Talbot wasn't exactly ready, wasn't exactly ripe yet, so it threw him in the void, made him desperate, gave him nothing. His addiction grew stronger and stronger. He had already become addicted, hooked on the serum and the blight that he used. Fight off the killers and the other things that were attacking him. He mutated, twisted, and won. But he became addicted in the process. And the entity slowly uses this to its advantage after throwing him in the void, after he came out of the void and was basically left with nothing but his addiction. The entity slowly just waited until the one moment that he needed it, one moment that he would do anything to get his fix again. And that's what he did. The entity waited for it, and the second Talbot asked, the entity provided, providing him with the serum and the flowers he needed. But at the cost of the blight becoming a mutated puppet of the entity. Now, keep in mind, when this chapter officially, or should I say when this tome officially came out, we had no idea what the Blight or the Alchemist was going to be. There were many headcanons and theories popping about saying that the Alchemist was Vigo, or the Alchemist was in fact Benedict Baker. Now we do know it is Talbot Grimes, and I'll talk about that later, but let me talk about how this so far affected our perspective at the moment. It essentially showed us that there was a possibility for survivors to become killers. Was a possibility for somebody to change or switch sides. But it was a rare case. They had to have something, had to have the monstrous intent to actually become that, had to be desperate enough. This essentially shows the themes of just how brutal the entity is and how conniving it could be, using the void and using addiction to gain itself a new puppet. It also has this whole theme of just showing you more explanation of what the blight is and how these killers got mutated along with it. We see now that 100% the blight does notice these killers, remember experimenting on them. As we know, he's pretty much experimented with almost all of them, even finding out there's even been more like the Legion and Ghostface that he's experimented on. So it is nice to have this collective recalling of what he's done. So it's a very nice theory, and honestly it's linked the Halloween spectrum into such a unique bubble. I'll probably do a retrospective on just the Halloween aspect in general, which I'll probably just touch on these stories again, but just as a singular tome story, it's actually rather interesting. We do know this ominous figure, and we understand how his mind is slowly twisting, how this ominous, faceless man that we don't know has become this mutated creature, has slowly succumbed and lost anything of humanity that he's had, and that is actually a very scary thought. As I said, I love the idea of a slowly twisting mentality, slowly seeing how people break down and become monsters. Sometimes people are already at that stage, sometimes you get to see the journey, and seeing the journey of someone break down is just perfect for abject horror and unsettling vibes. That's why I'll definitely say, at least for me, The Hunger is probably the best in the aspects of how I like the Blight story. If I would have to encapsulate this and the tome that comes after this, being the whole Blight saga, if you would. The hunger is essentially my favorite. We get this unknown figure who we could see slowly mutate and twist into the monster that we get. It could be anybody, it could be anything. It's just, we're seeing how someone has slowly broken down, lost all sense of remorse and humanity, like humanity for the atrocious stuff they've done in the past. And now all that's left is their addiction and desperation, and that's what twists them into becoming a monster. And that, my friends, is a scary thing. If I'd have to give this Tome story a rating, I'd say 7 or 8ish out of 10. It's definitely not my favorite of the killer-esque tomes, if you would, but it definitely is one of the ones I feel like is the most interesting in terms of what it shows and just the build-up hype that it eventually leads up to. Alright, let's talk about Doors Unknown. This is a more further breakdown into what mental tortures Talbot faced from the entity. Unlike the Hunger chapter, where it was more focused on his actual breaking down and succumbing to the entity's whim because of his addiction and his realization that he's lost humanity, this is just more of going through how the entity exactly broke him down, how he was broken down to begin with. We see him remembering elements of his past. We see him questioning himself and questioning, is this exactly what he wants? He seems to be losing his identity of what he calls self, having to even remind himself that his name is Talbot. We also see hooded figures of the school that he remembers from his own backstory and that we remember from his backstory. Along with other mental tribulations that the entity is putting him through, we essentially see Talbot going back in his mind and seeing a lot of the atrocities that he's done in life, and slowly realizing that he's breaking down. At first it crushes him, but then more and more he's losing his attachment, losing what makes him him, until eventually he's faced with these figures again. The figures from his past, the figures who salvaged him from the area he was. And essentially, they give him one ending finale, one ending little bit of advice, and that's to be careful what you wish for. Essentially harping back to Talbot's desire to not only have this plant, have this flower, but Talbot's desire of stepping in and trying to uncover and just investigate all of these things, and his need to investigate and research the flowers, Vigo, and everything is exactly what turned him into this brutal creature that we know today. Talbot lost everything when he came to the entity. He essentially was nothing more than a survivor, but a survivor who learned, a survivor who adapted, but also learned how to fight off the killers. He learned how to experiment for his own intrigue and write down notes of how exactly his experiments worked and how it went. He chronicled them as subjects, subjecting them to torture and mutation. And eventually, when one of them came back for revenge, he essentially had to subject himself to his own experiments, to his own torturous research, which led him to become a twisted thing. And it really just goes to show you the doors that are unknown, ironically enough, haha, is essentially something that you have to be careful of. You have to be careful of what you wish for. We all desire to head out and know what's beyond the door that we don't know, beyond the unknown door. But if we wish too hard to find out, we might realize that the thing that we're trying to find is way more dangerous, way more unexpected, and way more all-consuming than we realized. Sadly, Talbot figured this out the hard way. Let's hope no one follows in his footsteps. In relation to the original Tome I was talking about, Hunger, this didn't quite do it for me. I like the callback in Hunger to him remembering like his previous experiments and just slowly having him break down with more addiction after realizing that his humanity is essentially gone. This retreads over the fact that his humanity is slowly starting to slip away, and we see more of the mental strain that the entity put on him, but it doesn't essentially have that impact, at least for me, that the Hunger did. We have a name and a face to the figure now, so it has to be more personalized to that figure, and we did get a more personalized effect actually getting his backstory and things that relate to his past. But I feel like it didn't have that sting. We didn't feel his like complete abandonment and complete need. It felt like it was retreading ground that was more for a blank canvas of what the alchemist was, and trying to reapply that to Talbot with a little bit of, hey, these are what the figures mean now, and it didn't resonate with me. Yes, we know about Talbot's past, and yes, we know who these figures are to him, but in the grand scheme of things, Talbot legitimately means nothing. Essentially, this story didn't give us anything new about Talbot that we didn't already know. It retreads the exact same thing we had in Hunger, and instead it just basically puts a wall of Talbot's backstory, which you could read anyway, into it, which doesn't really give us any new ground to function. In the Claudette story, it explains that she's why she's shy, she's wired differently, she's twisted in a way. In Evan's story, it explains his abuse and the betrayal of his friends is what led him to becoming so cold and so heartless. We find out in David's story that David is so protective and so defensive over his friends because that's what when he had nothing left, his friends are the ones that still held him up. He's so angry and willing to fight because of the abuse that he's received. In Jane's story, we figure out that the reason why she's so inspirational and upbeat and so empathetic is because of just the harsh amount of stereotypes and just ridicule that she had to go through. But in this story, we don't figure out anything new about Talbot. We retread ground that was already in his backstory, and we retread themes that were already in Hunger. There's nothing new we find out about him. I'm really not a fan of this. It's just, as I said before, it's essentially Hunger with a little bit of Talbot splashed through. But again, as I said, as a conclusion to the Blight story, which I do hope there are more entries to it, it's interesting. I'll at least give it that. I do like seeing exactly how the entity broke him down, and that was interesting to see the imaginative tribulations that the entity put him through. Essentially seeing things like dragons attacking him, the figures from his past, the graveyards that he was thrown into. It's nice. But when explaining Talbot as a character, and when you look for the thing that I always look for in these like Tome stories, which is how it expands on that character and what themes it shows, how it expands on Talbot is essentially nothing. It really doesn't. Everything we find out in this is stuff we already knew about Talbot anyway, from both his backstory and Hunger. And the themes it treads is essentially the themes from Hunger, with the added bonus of be careful of like going too deep into the unknown because you'll regret what you wish for. So this is not my favorite Killer Tome. Honestly, this is probably down there with one of my least favorite, but I definitely do think it's an interesting look at how Talbot's character was essentially broken. If I would have to give it a personal score, it probably gets the lowest out of me for being a 4 out of 10. Don't worry, there are tomes that will definitely surpass this, but yeah, as I said, 4 out of 10 for me.